In the early morning of May 9th, 1945, while an unaccustomed, almost deafening silence had hung over vanquished Berlin for several hours, the streets of Prague shuddered with the roar of tracks and the explosions of shells. While the world, holding its breath, celebrated the signing of the act of unconditional surrender of the Third Reich, here, in the very heart of Bohemia, one of the strangest and most controversial finales in human history was playing out. Imagine a soldier who had traversed thousands of kilometers of scorched earth, survived countless battles, and witnessed the fall of the enemy capital, only to find himself in the sights of an enemy gun at the very moment the war was officially declared over. This paradox, the continuation of large-scale bloodshed against a backdrop of universal peace, poses a question that for decades remained in the shadow of official reports. Was the Prague Offensive the salvation of the city? Or was it a swift dash to assert political influence, paid for by the lives of those who had already mentally returned home? In early May 1945, the situation in Europe resembled a giant chessboard, on which the pieces were playing out a game whose outcome had been predetermined back in Yalta. However, a formidable force still remained in Czechoslovakia, Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner. This was a formation of over 1 million men, including about 10,000 artillery pieces, over 2,000 tanks, and about 1,000 aircraft. Schörner, known for his fanatical devotion and harshness, had no intention of simply laying down arms. His plan was simple and terrifying at the same time. Hold the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia for as long as possible, then break through to the west and surrender to American forces, avoiding an encounter with Soviet units. For the Soviet leadership, such a development was unacceptable. Control over Prague meant not only a military victory over the last major pocket of resistance, but also the establishment of long-term political dominance in Central Europe. Every minute of delay could lead to units of General George Patton's Third American Army, which were already in Pilsen, just 80 kilometers from the Czech capital, entering the city first. On May 5, 1945, a popular uprising erupted in Prague. The Czech National Council, inspired by the proximity of Allied armies, called the citizens to arms. However, the poorly armed rebels quickly realized that their enthusiasm was powerless against regular SS units equipped with armored vehicles and heavy weaponry. The city's streets turned into a labyrinth of barricades, and Prague radio continuously broadcast desperate calls for help in several languages. It was at this critical moment that a force emerged on the historical scene whose presence in this context still causes controversy and discomfort among proponents of simplified history. This was the 1st Division of the Russian Liberation Army under the command of Major General Sergei Bunyachenko. About 18,000 soldiers who, according to the official Soviet version, were considered solely traitors, suddenly found themselves the only organized force capable and, more importantly, willing to engage in battle with the SS to save the Czech capital. The presence of Vlasov's forces in Prague in early May came as a genuine surprise to all participants in the drama. The soldiers of Bunyachenko's division themselves understood that their situation was catastrophic. On one side, the advancing Red Army, which showed no mercy to those it considered traitors. On the other, the German command, which saw treachery in their actions. Entering the battle on the side of the Czech rebels was a desperate attempt for Bunyachenko and his subordinates to buy themselves a future, earn the forgiveness of the Western Allies, or at least create conditions for legal internment by the Americans. Throughout the 6th and 7th of May, Vlasov's forces engaged in heavy urban combat, driving SS units out of key areas, capturing airfields, and preventing the systematic destruction of the city by artillery. Without their participation, the uprising would likely have been suppressed with unprecedented brutality even before the arrival of the main Soviet forces. However, the ideological paradox was that the saviors of Prague for several crucial days were people wearing the same uniform as the aggressors, but who had turned their weapons against their recent allies. At this time, frantic preparations were underway at the headquarters of the 1st, 2nd, and 4th Ukrainian fronts. Marshal Ivan Konev, having received an order from Stalin, demanded an impossible pace from his troops. The tank armies of Lelyushenko and Rybalko were to make an unprecedented forced march through the Ore Mountains, covering hundreds of kilometers in a matter of hours. The logic of the Soviet High Command was dictated not only by the military necessity of liquidating Schörner's group, but also by deep distrust of the Allies. Despite agreements on the delimitation of zones of responsibility, Stalin feared that the Americans would succumb to the persuasions of the Czech government in exile and occupy Prague. This created an atmosphere of a race, where not only territories but also future political regimes were at stake. Soldiers who had just caught their breath after the capture of Berlin were again thrown into the inferno, and the pace of the offensive was such that the rear was catastrophically lagging behind, and equipment was operating at the limit of wear. The internal conflict within the ranks of the Russian Liberation Army reached its peak. General Andrei Vlasov, in a state of deep apathy, effectively removed himself from command, leaving Bunyachenko to make decisions. For the rank and file of the ROA, these days became a time of the most difficult moral choice. Many of them were former prisoners of war who had gone to serve the Germans out of hunger or a desire to escape the camps, and now they saw in the defense of Prague a chance to wash away their shame. However, the political reality was harsh. The Czech National Council, under pressure from pro-Soviet elements and fearing Moscow's wrath, effectively refused the further services of Vlasov's forces on May 7th, suggesting they leave the city. That same evening, Bunyachenko's division began its retreat to the west, leaving the rebels alone with the newly embittered Germans. This departure became a tragedy for the city, as SS units immediately launched a counteroffensive, seeking to punish Prague before their final retreat. Meanwhile, Soviet tank units were already entering Czechoslovakian territory on May 8th. The speed of their advance was phenomenal. Soldiers saw abandoned German convoys, thousands of prisoners wandering the roads, but the order was unequivocal. Do not engage in protracted battles, bypass pockets of resistance, and press on towards Prague. There was a tragic irony in this swift movement. Germany's official surrender had already been signed in Karlshorst, but for Army Group Center, it meant almost nothing. Schörner had given the order to break through to the west at all costs, ignoring the ceasefire order. As a result, fierce clashes, comparable in their intensity to the battles for Berlin, broke out on the roads leading to Prague. Soviet tank crews, who knew about the end of the war from radio broadcasts, continued to lose comrades to Faust patron fire and ambush guns. Every such engagement after May 8th was perceived as a monstrous injustice, as a senseless sacrifice on the altar of grand politics. On the night of May 9th, advanced detachments of the 10th Guards Tank Corps burst into Prague. The city greeted them with flowers, jubilation, and ongoing firefights. Soviet historiography for decades painted a picture of a unanimous and joyous liberation, deliberately glossing over the fact that by the time Konev's tanks arrived, the main German forces had already begun to leave the city, and a significant part of the work of suppressing SS garrisons had been carried out by Vlasovites and Czech insurgents. However, the political weight of May 9th was too great. Stalin needed a triumphant finale specifically for Soviet arms. As a result, the role of the ROA was erased from official reports, and any mention that the Czechs could have handled the situation themselves with American support was harshly suppressed. The price of this triumph was more than 1,000 Soviet soldiers who ended their lives directly on the streets of Prague, already under conditions of peace. A special place in this story is occupied by the fate of the soldiers of Bunyachenko's division. Having retreated from Prague, they hoped to find salvation with the Americans, but geopolitics once again dictated otherwise. In accordance with agreements, the American command handed over most of the Vlasovites to the Soviet side. For many of them, this meant an immediate end to their biography, or long years in camps. The conflict between the personal desire for redemption and the inexorable mechanism of state revenge manifested itself most vividly here. The Vlasovites, who for 3 days had been a shield for Prague, were not needed by either side. For Stalin, they remained a symbol of the most dangerous kind of collaborationism. For the Western Allies, an annoying impediment in relations with the Kremlin, and for the Czechs, an uncomfortable memory that should be forgotten as soon as possible for the sake of new socialist friendship. When we look at the Prague Offensive through the prism of decades, we see not just a military maneuver, but a profound contradiction between human value and state interest. The losses suffered by Soviet troops from May 9th to 12th, 1945, numbered in the thousands. Were these sacrifices necessary from a military point of view if the Reich had already capitulated? The answer lies in understanding that for the Soviet leadership, the war did not end with the capture of Berlin. It transitioned into a stage of consolidating spheres of influence. Prague was the key to the Balkans and Central Europe. To leave it to the Americans, or to allow Czechoslovakia's internal forces to take power without direct Soviet involvement, would have meant a loss in the future Cold War, which was already beginning to emerge in the contours of diplomatic dispatches. To grasp the scale of this final push, one should look at events through the eyes of those inside the steel boxes of the T-34s. The crew of Guards Lieutenant Ivan Goncharenko from the 63rd Guards Tank Brigade was among the first to burst into the awakening city. For these men, May 9th was no day of rest. Their tank, with hull number 24, maneuvered through narrow streets where a Faust patron could lurk around every corner. When they reached Mainz Bridge, they were met with dense fire from German self-propelled guns. Ivan Goncharenko ended his journey there, a few steps from the historical center, becoming a symbol of those who did not live to see a peaceful evening by just a few hours. There were hundreds of such stories. The tankers of the 4th Guards Tank Army made an incredible crossing in 3 days, covering more than 350 kilometers along mountain roads. The fatigue was such that driver mechanics fell asleep at the controls during short stops. But orders from front headquarters demanded only one thing: forward to Prague. The details of negotiations between the Czech National Council and representatives of the 1st Division of the ROA reveal an even more complex picture. On May 4th, a meeting took place in the small locality of Sukhomasti that could have changed the course of the region's history. Sergei Bunyachenko, understanding that his time was running out, presented the Czechs with a harsh condition. His division would engage in battle only if the Czech National Council guaranteed them political asylum and recognized them as full participants in the struggle against National Socialism. The Czechs, led by Professor Albert Prazak, were in despair. They knew that elite SS units, Wallenstein and Das Reich, were concentrated in Prague, ready to turn the city into ruins. Council representatives hesitated, understanding that any alliance with the Vlasovites would provoke the wrath of the advancing Red Army. However, the logic of survival prevailed. An agreement was reached, albeit one that had the character of a temporary military alliance. Throughout May 6th, the Vlasovites fought for the Ruzinia airfield and the Pankráks district. Their artillery suppressed German firing positions that were methodically shelling rebel barricades. During these hours, a phantasmagorical scene could be observed on the city streets. Soldiers in German uniforms, but with tricolor patches on their sleeves, fiercely fought other soldiers in the same uniform, to the approving shouts of Czech residents. This was a moment of supreme paradox. Traitors to the Reich were saving a Slavic capital from that very Reich, hoping that the blood shed for Prague would outweigh their previous choice. However, by May 7th, when it became clear that the Americans did not intend to move beyond the Pilsen line and Soviet troops were already approaching, Czech politicians began to distance themselves from their unexpected allies. During the evening council meeting, it was announced that the continued presence of Bunyachenko's division in the city creates political complications. In essence, they were used as a tool to save the city at the most critical moment and discarded as soon as the threat of immediate destruction passed. The atmosphere at the headquarters of the 4th Guards Tank Army in those days was permeated with nervous anticipation. General Dmitry Lelushenko constantly received reports on road conditions and enemy resistance. The Soviet command was aware of the uprising and the actions of the Third Force, but officially this was ignored. The reports only mentioned German fascist invaders and liberated Prague. The crossing of the Ore Mountains became a real test for the equipment. Narrow serpentines, spring thaw, and abandoned German convoys created gigantic traffic jams. Tankers literally had to push German vehicles off the roads to continue moving. Every hour of delay was perceived as a personal defeat. When the advanced units of the 10th Guards Corps finally saw the spires of Prague's churches, they were seized by a feeling close to frenzy. They knew that behind them was the full might of a vast country. But here, at the spearhead of the attack, they were alone against fanatics who had nothing to lose. The inner conflict of the Soviet soldier in those days was connected with the realization of the value of life. After the capture of Berlin, many believed that the limit of losses had been exhausted. However, the Prague operation demanded new sacrifices. From the 7th to the 9th of May, the losses of the tank armies were significant. German units, striving to break out of the cauldron that was closing east of Prague, made desperate attempts to break through. In the vicinity of the city of Jaromír, a battle unfolded where Soviet units clashed with the remnants of elite enemy armored divisions. It was a war of attrition, where no one wanted to be the last to fall on this long road. The names of young lieutenants and sergeants whose lives ended in these days fill the pages of regimental journals, becoming a silent reproach to political ambitions that demanded haste. Do you think such haste by the Soviet command was justified? Or should American troops, who were much closer, have been allowed to enter the city first, thereby saving thousands of lives of our compatriots? Write your opinion in the comments, as this question still divides historians into two irreconcilable camps. The ideological conflict of this operation lay in the clash of two visions of the post-war world. For Stalin, Prague was not just a city but a symbol of Slavic unity under the aegis of Moscow. Any other decision was perceived as a threat to the security of the USSR's borders. On the other hand, Western leaders, particularly Churchill, urged Truman to show decisiveness, and occupy as much territory in Czechoslovakia as possible to create a counterbalance to Soviet influence. In this geopolitical struggle, the residents of Prague and the soldiers of both sides were merely pawns. The tragedy of the Vlasovites here appears most vividly. They tried to play by the rules of great politics, having no resources for it other than their lives. Their attempt to become a third force was doomed from the start. As in a world divided into spheres of influence, there was no place for those who had twice changed sides. By the morning of May 10th, Prague was almost completely cleared of organized enemy groups. However, the echo of war continued to resound in the surroundings. Army Group Center effectively disintegrated into separate detachments that tried to escape to the west through the forests. Soviet troops moved into the phase of sweeping the area. This was a period when the tension did not subside. A random shot from the forest could cut short anyone's life. It was in these days that mass captures of prisoners occurred, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. But among this stream of people, those who wore the ROA uniform stood out particularly. For them, captivity meant not the end of the war, but the beginning of a new circle of trials. The fate of Sergei Bunyachenko and his officers was predetermined. They faced a swift trial and an end in Moscow, while rank-and-file soldiers were sent deep into the territory of the Union, where their traces often disappeared in the boundless expanses of the camps. The transformation of the perception of these events in Czech society has gone through several stages. In the first post-war years, gratitude to the Red Army was sincere and universal. However, as the communist regime strengthened, and especially after the events of 1968, the memory of 45 began to transform. Those who once welcomed Soviet tanks with flowers began to ask themselves, did these tanks bring a new form of unfreedom? In this context, the figure of the Vlasovites began to be used as a tool for deconstructing the Soviet historical myth. If their role was previously completely denied, it is now sometimes unjustifiably extolled. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the middle, between pragmatic betrayal and a sudden impulse to save the city for a phantom chance of saving themselves. The culmination of the entire operation came on the 11th and 12th of May in the area of Slivice, where the remnants of German troops under the command of General von Puckler refused to lay down their arms before Soviet units, hoping for the arrival of the Americans. This was the last major battle in Europe where heavy artillery and aviation were used. The battle lasted several hours, and its ferocity astonished even seasoned veterans. When the last gun fell silent, it became clear that World War II on this continent was truly over. But the price of these last shots was horrifying. Hundreds of people lost their lives, even as celebratory fireworks thundered in Moscow. This final clash marked the end of a long history of confrontation, but it also opened a new chapter, a chapter of a divided Europe and a hidden struggle for the minds and souls of people. The resonance of these events today is manifested in furious disputes over monuments. When the statue of Marshal Konev was dismantled in Prague, it caused a wave of indignation in Russia and deep understanding among a part of Czech society. For some, it was an act of ingratitude. For others, a cleansing from the symbols of an imperial past. This conflict of memory shows that the events of May 1945 have not yet become just history. They remain part of living politics, a tool of influence, and a way of identification. The lesson of the Prague operation is that a military victory achieved without considering the interests of the people and at the cost of wasted blood will always carry the seed of future conflict. We must remember the feat of the ordinary soldier, but we have no right to forget those who made decisions that led to these last, perhaps superfluous, losses. When we return to the beginning of our story, to that quiet morning of May 9th in Berlin and thundering Prague, we understand that history is not just dates and arrows on maps. It is thousands of individual destinies intertwined into one tragic knot. A Soviet tanker, a Czech rebel, a Vlasovite, a German fanatic. All of them were part of this great drama, where the lines between good and evil sometimes blurred in the smoke of fires. The Prague operation remains a reminder to us of how important it is to maintain humanity even in the darkest times, and how dangerous it is to become a hostage to ideological schemes. May the memory of those days not be a cause for new enmity, but a lesson in how fragile peace is and how high the price of every hour lived in conditions of war. Concluding our analysis, it is worth acknowledging that the Prague Offensive was a brilliant military achievement in terms of its pace and scale. Yet simultaneously, it became a profound human tragedy. Politics triumphed over common sense, and the symbolism of the date proved more important than the lives of specific individuals. We remember those who entered Prague as liberators, and those who defended it despite their questionable past. It is crucial that history does not transform into a convenient picture, but remains an honest mirror in which we can see both heroism and treachery, and that very unnecessary blood that was shed on the pavements of one of the world's most beautiful cities after peace had officially arrived. This is our shared memory, and only by preserving it in its entirety can we avoid repeating such mistakes in the future.